you very much, everyone, for coming here. This paper is actually part of my PhD study, which is motivated by the immensity of the problem of poverty in developing countries. Recently, international community has adopted sustainable development goals. One of the first goals is to end poverty by the year 2030 everywhere in all its forms. So that's quite an ambitious challenge. And with the adoption of these sustainable development goals, there is a greater focus on provision of social protection as a means to alleviate poverty. However, we have very limited empirical evidence on the effectiveness of social protection as an instrument to end poverty. So this paper actually makes a modest contribution in this area. Before proceeding further, I think it's important that I define two terminologies. Poverty. Poverty is normally defined in terms of a predetermined poverty line, which is the minimum threshold level of economic well-being, for example, consumption expenditure, below which an individual or a household is considered poor. If we set poverty line to be about 1.75, about 1 billion people are poor at present around the world. And if we raise the poverty line a bit to about 2.5, then about 3 billion people are poor at present. So this is an enormous challenge for policymakers in developing countries.
Dollars per day. US dollars per day.
Yes, that's the US dollar. It's on purchasing power parity. However, this ex-post poverty provides a misleading picture of households' economic well-being because it excludes substantial portion of households that are above poverty line, but they are likely to become poor in future. So we need to define vulnerability or future poverty. Vulnerability to poverty is technically a probability to fall below poverty line in future. In a plain language, it is the risk of poverty or threat of future poverty. Households in developing countries are impacted by different kinds of shocks. So depending on the shocks, for example, if it is idiosyncratic household-specific shock, like death of the main earner of the household, that's called vulnerability to idiosyncratic shock. And if it is covariate shock, for example, flooding or disaster, that is called vulnerability to covariate shock. Exactly how many people are vulnerable in the world, we don't have statistics on that. Unlike poverty, we have poverty statistics, but not the estimates on vulnerability to poverty. So social protection are a set of instruments that are designed to address poverty and vulnerability to poverty. It has got two components: social assistance or social safety nets, and social insurance, social security benefits. Social security benefits are contributory payments, and social assistance is tax financed. As I stated earlier, that's the main theme of my PhD research, because that's part of my PhD study. I analyze poverty based on both ex-post poverty concept and ex-ante vulnerability to poverty. And I use different indicators to measure these two measures. For example, monetary poverty, which is based on consumption expenditures. Nutrition poverty, which is based on kilocalorie consumption. And multidimensional poverty, which is based on different dimensions, for example, education, health, and living standard. I captured these dimensions through 12 different indicators to construct a multidimensional poverty index. But in this study, we are actually concerning more on monetary poverty, which is consumption-based. I disentangle vulnerability into its sources, whether vulnerability is poverty-induced, that is because of low expected mean consumption, or it's because of the greater variance in consumption or risk-induced vulnerability. I then further disentangle risk-induced vulnerability depending on the shock, vulnerability to covariate shocks, and vulnerability to idiosyncratic shock. And finally, I evaluate the impact of social protection on vulnerability to idiosyncratic covariate shocks and ex-post poverty. So in this paper or presentation, I'll concern about this part: social protection and vulnerability to covariate, idiosyncratic shocks, and ex-post poverty. if we look at the regional comparison of social protection expenditures in different regions and corresponding percent of poor population, then we see that the region that spend more on social protection have less poor, and as compared to region that spend less on social protection and have more poor. And if you look more closely at different countries, especially focusing on the case of Pakistan, then this country spend quite less on social protection as in comparison to other countries, and hence we see a high level of income inequalities in Pakistan. However, spending less on social protection in comparison to other countries at a particular point in time does not necessarily mean that Pakistan is not increasing its share of social protection spending. In fact, when we look at the trends of social protection spending in Pakistan, we see that social protection spending is continuously going up from 2008 to 2016, from 15 billion rupees to 102 billion rupees. And if we look at the corresponding poverty rates in Pakistan, we see that poverty is also continuously declining, especially from 2001 to 2030 in all areas, national level, at urban and rural areas. In 2013, about 30% people were poor in Pakistan, which is 55 million people. That's more than twice the population of Australia. So that's an enormous challenge for policymakers in Pakistan to catch up with sustainable development goals to end poverty by the year 2030. Looking at these general descriptive statistics or graphs of social protection spending and corresponding poverty reduction, we may say that social protection has a positive relationship with poverty. However, this may or may not be true, because a simple descriptive statistic could be misleading. So there are studies that show that once we control for different other factors, this apparent relationship between social protection and poverty disappears or even turn negative. So we need a multi-level, multivariate model to investigate exact impact of social protection on poverty and vulnerability to poverty. So why is this study? We have undertaken this study because Government of Pakistan and various official documents have stated very clearly that the role of social protection is to address household vulnerability to poverty and to mitigate idiosyncratic and covariate shocks. However, when we look at the empirical evidence in Pakistan, there is complete absence of studies that evaluate impact of social protection on poverty and vulnerability to poverty, because most of the studies are, most of the studies focus on these are descriptive studies. They focus on targeting and coverages of social protection programs, but not the impact of social protection on certain indicators. However, this is not surprising, because if we look at the overall mainstream literature on social protection, then one of the most serious concerns that is highlighted in the literature is that there is overall lack of quantitative study in this area, and because most of the study are telling us definitions and conceptual frameworks of social protection and vulnerability to poverty measurement, but there are now actual studies that have actually employed those methodologies to evaluate the impact of social protection. There are some studies, but limited empirical evidence that we have. These studies basically focus on impact evaluation on ex post poverty once it occurs, rather than on vulnerability to poverty. We do have few studies that evaluate social protection on vulnerability to poverty, but they provide mixed finding, which means that the impact of social protection are context dependent. Perhaps the most serious concern is that these studies do not eliminate selection bias from unobservable factors that might otherwise biased impact estimates. So I'll talk about this later.
Could you just tease out a little bit what you mean by social protection?
Yes.
What's included in social protection?
Oh, so I'll give it next slide. Yeah. So what are the challenges that we faced? Challenges are basically data driven. For example, if we talk about vulnerability to poverty measurement, then at least we have two pieces of information that are needed: expected mean consumption and variance of consumption over the period of time. Now, this means that we need a panel data, a very rich and lengthy panel data, which is very rare in developing countries. In the absence of panel data, we can estimate vulnerability to poverty, but with very strong assumption. And one of the assumption is that variance of consumption across household represent over time variance in consumption. So that's a very strong assumption, and it's quite debatable. But there are cross-validation exercises that are using panel data and cross-sectional data, and they suggest that vulnerability measurement using cross-sectional data a big cross-sectional data and spatially dispersed data can do a reasonably good job to estimate vulnerability. And following these exercises, there is no emerging literature on cross-sectional studies on vulnerability measurement using cross-sectional data, and these are being published in reputed journals. In impact assessment, the most appropriate way is to use randomized controlled trial to evaluate the impact of any intervention. What we do as we know, we do in randomized controlled trial, we carefully select our eligible participants of certain intervention based on certain criteria. So, and then we can simply split this eligible households into two groups before assigning treatment, and then we can randomly assign treatments to one group and not to other groups. So we call this group as treatment group and this call as control group. So we can simply take the difference between these two, and we can that difference can be attributed to social protection. However, problem is that in most of the survey data, we do not have the assignments are not randomly, treatments are not assigned randomly. What we have is we have a group of participants and a group of non-participants in most of the survey data. Now, we cannot simply take the difference between these two groups and we cannot attribute it to social protection, but because these two groups differ with each other in many respects. So we need to create a counterfactual for these participants to estimate the impact. And we use two methods, propensity score matching method and endogenous switching regression methods to create that counterfactual. The data that we have multiple indicator cluster survey. This is the joint venture of UNDP, UNICEF, and Government of the Punjab. The most important feature of this data is it's a very big data set that is consists of 600,000 individuals in 90,000 households. This is the first data in Pakistan that is town representative. It provides information on 150 towns and 36 districts for all households in rural and urban areas and major cities as well. It provides information on more than 100 indicators of socioeconomic well-being of household. More importantly, it provides information on quantities of food consumed and monetary expenditures on non-food items. So we can construct our total dependent variable, that is consumption expenditure, from this information based on the prices. It provides information on social protection programs and number of beneficiaries. So if you look at social protection Pakistan programs in Pakistan, so these are two components: social safety nets and social security. We have different programs in social safety nets. These are basically cash transfer programs. One of the problems with these is that they are thinly spread across too many households. About 16% households in Pakistan received any form of social protection in Punjab province. In this study, we do not investigate each individual program because of time constraint and some other reason. We treat social protection as a system rather than as an individual program. I'm not going to present a detailed descriptive statistic, but just to make a point, if we look at consumption expenditure of households that are receiving social protection, that is 290 rupees, as compared to those who are not receiving, that is 211, and the difference is 8. So consumption expenditure is the higher for household who are receiving social protection. So again, we may say that social protection has some relationship with consumption expenditure, because they have household that are receiving social protection has a higher consumption expenditure. But this may not be true, because if you look at education, education of the head of the household in the years and proportion of earning members in a household, we see that education levels are higher in the household who are receiving social protection, and same as the case with the proportion of earning member. So this difference might not be because of social protection, but to many other factors. So we cannot simply attribute it. So we need to control for all these variables. So, okay. So this is the method that I have not. I'm not going to present detailed derivation, but just to give you idea, if we have 3 pieces of information, we are able to estimate vulnerability. If we have expected mean consumption for each household, if we have a predetermined poverty line, and if we have expected variance in consumption due to idiosyncratic shock and due to covariate shocks. If we have these set of informations, we can simply calculate vulnerability based on this formula, and its value ranges from 0 to 1. However, in order to calculate this expected mean consumption and variance consumption using a cross-sectional data, we need a multi-level model proposed by Gunter and Hartigan. In this model, we first regress consumption expenditure on set of household and community characteristics. This gives us 2 error terms. One is household level error term, and the other one is community level error term, and interaction. And this community, we do not consider this community level error term. If you ask a question later, I'll explain why. So we assume this household, this error components captures the impact of shocks. This captures the impact of idiosyncratic shock, and this captures the impact of covariate shocks. And we further assume that these error components can be explained. This is correlated with household and community characteristics. So we secure these error terms, household level error term, and regresses on set of household and community characteristics, and for community level error term on a community characteristics to get our idiosyncratic variance and community variance. And then we simply replace this here to get our desired outcome variable, which is vulnerability to idiosyncratic shock or vulnerability to covariate shock. In impact assessment, we first use propensity score matching method. The basic idea of this method is we actually generate propensity score for each household in our data set. How we do this, we simply using a probit model, we generate propensities given some observable characteristics, for example, education, wealth, health, etc. And once we have propensities for each household, those who receive social protection and those who do not receive social protection, we then define a region of common sport, which is the region where the propensity score for household that receive social protection and those who do not receive social protection overlap. We exclude all households that are not within the region of common sport. After this, we simply create matches for household, those who receive social protection and those who do not receive social protection and who are similar in terms of propensity score value or similar in terms of characteristics. Once we have this, we simply take the difference between treated group and control group, and this difference can be attributed to social protection. But problem with this propensity score matching method is that it does not control for, we are controlling for observable characteristics here, but it does not control for unobservable heterogeneity between recipients and non-recipients. So we need to control that, and for this we use endogenous switching regression methods. In this method, we basically have 2 equations. One is selection equation, which is similar to propensity score matching method, because here we are actually estimating the probability of household to receive social protection or not to receive social protection. And then we have a conditional on this selection equation. We have outcome equation, which tells us the impact of social protection on our outcome variables. We have 3 outcome variables. One is consumption expenditure that is a proxy for poverty. One is idiosyncratic vulnerability, and the other one is covariate vulnerability. And that is for households, those who receive social protection and those who do not receive social protection. In order for these equations to be identified, we need some set of instrument to be added to this selection equation. So we use two selection instruments, and we perform some validation exercises to get an idea whether these selection instruments are valid or not. These equations are estimated using maximum full information maximum likelihood methods. When we predict this model to get the conditional expectation, we get actual estimate, because this is actual because these are the households that we have in our data set. So the vulnerability of households, those who are receiving social protection. So for example, what is the vulnerability or poverty of households, those who are receiving social protection? We can actually observe this because that's in our data set. And then we create a counterfactual, that is the vulnerability or poverty of households. What would have been the poverty and vulnerability of households had they not received social protection? So that's a counterfactual of the same households. So once we have these conditional expectation, and this lambda is an inverse mill ratio that actually estimated from our selection equation, and that actually captures the unobservable, that control for unobservable heterogeneity. And once we have these conditional expectations, we can take simply the difference of this equation and this one, and we can attribute the difference to social protection. I have not presented, not going to present detailed regression analysis, but just to give you so this is a falsification test on the validity of selection instrument that we have used. We have used two instruments. One is a household having a widow member, and this is based on review of literature. Household having a widow member, and household any member who is working in other city or district. Our goal is to find those instruments, those variables who are related to our treatment variable, that is social protection, but not related to our outcome variables, that is expenditure and idiosyncratic and covariate vulnerability. And we see that these two variables, these two instruments are positively and statistically significant in the selection equation. They are independently and both jointly statistically significant, but here we do not say any significance here in terms of our outcome. So this means that our selection instruments are valid. So these are our results. Using endogenous switching regression methods, households that receive social protection, they have 219 rupees of consumption expenditures. The same household, their expenditure would have been 128 had they not received social protection. So the difference is 91, it's about 70%. Similarly, we see that the idiosyncratic vulnerability, households that are receiving social protection would have been 18% more vulnerable had they not received this social protection. And similarly, in the case of covariate shock, covariate vulnerability, we have 40%, which means that household would have been 14% more vulnerable to covariate shocks had they not received social protection. We have similar estimates in the other method that we use, propensity score matching method. The only difference is that we have the magnitude is different, but the statistical significance and the direction is the same. It is understandable why is this so, because this method does not control for unobservable heterogeneity, but only control for some observable characteristics. So we have, otherwise we have similar results here. We also see the heterogeneity of social protection in different quantiles. We see that the poverty reducing impact of social protection are higher for household in the higher quantiles, but lower for household in the lower quantiles. Opposite is the case in the case of idiosyncratic vulnerability and covariate shock. We see that vulnerability reducing impacts are higher for household in the lower quintiles, and in fact no impacts here in the higher quintiles. Why is this so? Why is the poverty reducing impact are lower here and higher here? Due to data limitation, we could not investigate this, but I've gone through the literature, and based on the literature, we can say that one study actually suggests that we have a lower impacts here because of the possible crowding out of private investment. Possible crowding out of private transfers from family and friends in the lower quintiles. One study suggests that about 80% of the private transfer from family and friends are simply disappear if a household in the lowest quintile take benefits from government programs. So that could be an explanation. And why is the vulnerability reducing impact higher for households in the lower quintile? This might be because these households are household in the lower quintiles are risk averse, and they are sensitive to insurance. So it means that even a small amount of insurance could stabilize their consumption stream. So that's why we are seeing have good impacts here rather than in the upper quintiles.
Just helping with interpretations of the -0.23.
Oh.
Is that saying that the people in the lowest wealth quintile are more vulnerable? Are made more vulnerable by this?
No. So this means that the reduction in vulnerability, 23% reduction in vulnerability here in the lowest quintile, 22 here, 18 here, and in fact this is, we do not interpret because it's positive, so it means no impact. Okay. Yes. So in conclusion, the objective of the study was that what is the role of social protection in reducing poverty and vulnerability to poverty. We find that it has a positive and statistically significance. Our results are robust across method. However, social protection intervention work better for some groups rather than others. We treated social protection as a system. There is room for further studies in evaluating the impact on different individual programs. Okay, so before I close, I would like to acknowledge the tremendous generous support that I received from my supervisor Amin and Steve, not only in terms of my studies but also in terms of some of the personal challenges that I faced during the study. I also acknowledge the scholarship that I received from UWA, without which I think this study would not have been possible. Thank you very much.